On August 10, 1628, thousands gathered in Stockholm Harbor to witness a miracle of military engineering. The Vasa, the new flagship of the Swedish Imperial Navy, was setting sail. Adorned with hundreds of gilded sculptures, armed with 64 heavy cannons, it was the most powerful warship on the planet. As it caught the wind, a massive cheer went up from the shore. Then a sudden gust of wind hit. The ship tilted. It tilted again and did not recover. In front of everyone, the Invincible warship leaned over. Water poured through its open lower gun ports, and it sank. Less than a mile into its maiden voyage, the pride of an empire was at the bottom of the harbor. Foreign ambassadors rushed to send reports of the humiliating disaster. The question on everyone's mind was immediate and furious. What just happened, and who was to blame for a catastrophe that cost more than the country's annual budget? News reached the Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, who was leading his army in Poland. His reaction was pure rage. In a letter, he wrote, "Imprudence and negligence must have been the cause," and demanded the guilty parties be found and punished immediately. An inquest was convened. The surviving captain and crew were arrested and interrogated. But as the investigation unfolded, a far more complicated and dangerous truth began to surface, one that no one wanted to admit. The investigators focused on two possibilities. Was the ship overloaded, or was the crew incompetent? The captain, Sofring Jonsson, swore the ship was properly ballasted and that he had not been negligent. He then revealed something shocking. Months before the launch, he had performed a stability test. He had 30 men run back and forth across the upper deck to make the ship rock. After only 3 runs, the ship was rolling so violently they had to stop for fear it would capsize at the dock.
This was the critical detail. The ship's chief builder, Henrik Heibertson, had died a year before the ship was completed. His subordinates knew the ship was dangerously unstable, but they were under immense pressure from the king to finish it. Why wasn't the stability test reported? Because the king's own admiral was present, and he chose to ignore it. Everyone was too afraid to tell the notoriously impatient king that his magnificent superweapon had a fatal flaw. But here is where the investigation gets truly bizarre. The ship's original plans were for a smaller vessel with a single gun deck. But the king, hearing that his Danish rivals were building a ship with 2 gun decks, changed the order mid-construction. He demanded the Vasa also have 2 gun decks, packed with an unprecedented number of heavy cannons. The builders had to add the second gun deck on top of a hull that was never designed to support that weight. The inquest was a political nightmare. The crew wasn't at fault. The shipbuilders had followed the plans, but the plans themselves had been altered by the direct orders of the king. Every finger pointed back to the one man in Sweden who could not be punished. In the end, no one was found guilty. The blame was left ambiguous, and the disaster was quietly swept under the rug. The king's hubris had sunk his own flagship before it ever fired a shot in anger. With the inquest over, the focus turned to recovery. The Vasa had sunk in only 100 feet of water, and its tall masts stuck out above the surface like tombstones. It was so close, so tangible. Salvage was not just possible, it was expected. The cannons alone were immensely valuable. Dozens of attempts were made over the next few decades using primitive diving bells. Heavy, air-filled bells lowered over the wreck, allowing a diver to work for a few minutes at a time in the dark, freezing water.
These early efforts were heroic, but they could not lift the 700-ton waterlogged hull. A team in the 1660s did manage to recover over 50 of the valuable bronze cannons using grappling hooks and the diving bell, a remarkable achievement for the time. But this salvage work also damaged the ship's upper decks. After that, the Vasa was largely abandoned. The masts eventually broke off, and its location was forgotten. The ship vanished from sight and for 300 years from memory. But this is where a new story begins. In the early 1950s, a man named Anders Franzen, an amateur historian and researcher, became obsessed with finding the lost ship. He was not a traditional archaeologist. He was an expert on naval history who hypothesized that the unique water of Stockholm Harbor might have protected the ship from the creatures that normally devour wooden wrecks. The water was too cold and had too little salt for the shipworm, a mollusk that destroys submerged wood. For 2 years, Franzen methodically dragged the harbor floor from a small motorboat. He used grappling hooks and a homemade core sampler, a heavy pipe designed to pull up a plug of whatever it hit on the seabed. He cross-referenced old maps and documents, narrowing down the search area. He faced constant skepticism. Everyone believed the ship had long since disintegrated. He was chasing a ghost. But his theory about the water's preservative qualities gave him hope. On August 25, 1956, his core sampler hit a large hard object. When he pulled it up, the plug was not mud or rock. It was a piece of blackened ancient oak. He had found it. The ghost ship was real. waiting in the darkness exactly where it had sunk 333 years earlier. Finding it was a monumental achievement, but it was just the beginning. Now came an even more impossible question. How do you lift a 700-ton waterlogged artifact from the seabed without it collapsing into a pile of mud?
A massive salvage operation funded by the Swedish government and private donors began. The plan was audacious. Navy divers spent 2 years digging 6 massive tunnels under the ship's hull in the near-zero visibility mud. It was incredibly dangerous work. They then passed huge steel cables through the tunnels, which were attached to 2 enormous lifting pontoons on the surface. The entire plan was to gently cradle the ship and lift it from below, distributing the weight evenly. The lifting process was done in 18 stages over several weeks, slowly moving the ship from the deep water into a shallow, protected bay. The world watched, holding its breath. Then, on April 24, 1961, the final lift began. As the pontoons pumped out their water ballast and rose, the ancient ship began to surface. First, the broken stumps of the masts appeared. Then the grotesque carved faces on the hull emerged from the water for the first time in 3 centuries. It worked. The ship held together. As it was towed into the dry dock, archaeologists prepared for the most incredible excavation of their lives. The Vasa was not just a ship, it was a perfect time capsule. The mud that had filled the hull had created an anaerobic environment, preserving everything inside. They found not just the ship's equipment, but the personal belongings of the crew, their clothes, their tools, their games, and even the remains of their last meal. They also found the skeletons of at least 15 people who went down with the ship. Modern forensic analysis of these remains has given us a detailed picture of life in the 17th century. We know their diet, their diseases, and their physical hardships. One skeleton, nicknamed Gustav, has been reconstructed, allowing us to look into the face of a man who died in the disaster. The ship was no longer just a historical failure, it was a human tragedy.
But what about the ship itself? The preservation was miraculous. Over 98% of the original wood was intact, but now it faced a new enemy, the air. As the waterlogged wood began to dry, it would shrink, crack, and disintegrate into dust. For 17 years, the ship was continuously sprayed with polyethylene glycol, a waxy substance that slowly replaced the water in the wood, stabilizing it on a cellular level. It was a painstaking process to save the ship a second time. The thousands of artifacts found with the ship were also preserved. These included 6 of the ship's 10 sails, which are the oldest surviving sails in the world. They were found neatly folded in their lockers, ready for use. Also found were sea chests belonging to the officers and crew, containing everything from pewter jugs and coins to shoes and sewing kits. The Vasa provides the single most detailed snapshot of 17th century naval life that exists anywhere on Earth. The ship's sculptures are another marvel. There were over 700 of them, designed to glorify the Swedish king and intimidate his enemies. They depicted lions, Roman emperors, biblical heroes, and grotesque sea monsters. Originally, they were painted in bright, vivid colors, making the ship look less like a weapon and more like a floating work of art. The scientific analysis of the wreck proves conclusively that the ship was indeed dangerously top-heavy and unstable, just as the captain had warned. The story seems complete, a tale of royal arrogance, a stunning failure, and a modern miracle of recovery. But let's re-examine the design. It wasn't just the king's fault. In the 17th century, shipbuilders didn't use blueprints or mathematical formulas. They built based on experience and rules of thumb passed down through generations. When the king demanded a ship with 2 gun decks, a type of vessel that had never been built in Sweden before, the shipbuilder had no prior experience to draw from.
He was innovating in the dark, and the king's impatience removed any chance for careful trial and error. The Vasa disaster was a brutal lesson in the limits of traditional craftsmanship when confronted with demands for new technology. It was a failure that ultimately helped push naval architecture towards becoming a more formal mathematical science. The ship had to sink so that future ships could float. PlayAnimation.move. Today, the Vasa rests in a custom-built museum in Stockholm, which is the most visited museum in Scandinavia. It is a stunning sight. A massive, dark leviathan from another age, preserved in stunning detail. Standing before it, you can almost hear the creak of the timbers and the shouts of the crew. It is one of the only places in the world where you can step back in time and come face to face with the raw, intimidating power of the 17th century. The ultimate irony of the Vasa is that its complete and utter failure as a ship is what made it such a priceless success as a historical artifact. Had it not sunk in the protective waters of the harbor, it would have sailed off to war, been damaged in battle, been refitted, and eventually rotted away in a breaker's yard like every other ship of its time. Its perfect failure led to its perfect preservation. So we are left with a story not of a great naval victory, but of a magnificent mistake. The Vasa serves as a timeless monument to the dangers of ambition when it outpaces knowledge. It is a lesson in humility, written in 700 tons of oak. A warship that never fought a battle, never fired a cannon in anger, and never left its own harbor, yet it became one of the most important ships in history, teaching us more in its silence than it ever could have in the roar of battle.